A luxurious members-only resort becomes the stage for an explosive confrontation when a wealthy black woman walks in, only to have security called on her by an entitled club member. But what happens when he realizes who she really is? Stick around to find out, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Danielle Carter stepped into the grand marble-floored lobby of Oceanside Elite Resort with an effortless grace that turned heads. She wasn't flashy. Her style was understated, chic, the kind of wealth that didn't need validation. A crisp, cream-colored blazer over a fitted jumpsuit, sleek heels clicking softly against the polished floors. She carried herself with a kind of confidence that didn't beg for attention, but commanded it nonetheless. She had seen this place before, in photos and legal documents, in the financial breakdowns she'd studied when sealing the deal, but this was her first time setting foot in it as the owner. And yet, from the moment she walked in, she felt it. That shift in the air, the unspoken scrutiny. She noticed the quick glances from the front desk staff, subtle but weighted, before they turned their attention elsewhere, pretending not to stare. She saw how the well-dressed couples in the lounge, sipping cocktails and laughing over quiet conversations, suddenly seemed aware of her. Danielle wasn't naive. This was a place that had for years catered to a very specific crowd. Old money, exclusivity, dressed up as tradition. Diversity wasn't exactly in its history, and even though her name was now on the deed, the people here, they didn't know that. Not yet. She strolled toward the concierge desk, her hands in her pockets, exuding the kind of unbothered power that only came from knowing a secret everyone else was blind to. Before she could even reach the counter, though, a voice, clipped, dripping with irritation, cut through the air behind her. "Excuse me, can I help you with something?" Danielle turned, slow and deliberate, her eyes landing on a man in his mid-50s, stiff posture, salt and pepper hair slicked back, a tailored blazer, expensive watch, the entire walking cliché of a wealthy, important man. He was looking at her like she was an unscheduled delivery, out of place. "Not that it's any of your business," she said, a small, polite smile forming, "but I'm just checking things out." Richard Dawson, longtime club member, resort regular, and well-known elitist, narrowed his eyes. "Checking things out?" His laugh was dry, humorless. "Ma'am, I don't think this is the kind of place where you just check things out." Danielle felt it then, the shift in tone, the unspoken message. He wasn't just questioning why she was here. He was questioning how she was here. Before she could respond, Richard was already turning to the front desk staff, motioning with his hand as if waving away a nuisance. "Can we get security over here?" he called, his voice loud enough to carry through the grand lobby. "Looks like we have an unauthorized guest wandering around." Danielle raised a brow. "Wandering?" she echoed, amused. "Is that what I'm doing?" Richard barely spared her a glance. His focus was on making sure she left before she made anyone too uncomfortable. "It's not your fault," he said, patronizing, as if talking to a lost child. "I'm sure you just got turned around. This is a private establishment, and members have certain standards, you understand." Danielle let out a soft breath, shaking her head with a small chuckle. This was almost too easy. A security guard appeared. Tall, stocky, the kind of presence meant to be intimidating but hesitant. He had seen situations like this play out before, and something about the way this woman stood, calm, composed, almost entertained, made him second-guess how this was going to end. "Ma'am," the guard said, keeping his voice level, "I'm gonna have to ask if you're a guest here." Danielle tilted her head. "Do I look like a guest?" The guard hesitated. "Well, Richard cut in before he could answer. "Of course she's not. Just look at her. I've been coming here for 15 years. I know when someone doesn't belong." Danielle exhaled through her nose, a slow, controlled kind of amusement. She could shut this down right now. She could pull out the papers, make the announcement, watch this man crumble in real time. But where was the fun in that? She crossed her arms, pretending to consider. "Interesting," she said. "And how exactly do you determine who belongs?" Richard scoffed. "Let's not make this something it's not, okay? It's about exclusivity, a certain caliber of people, that's all." Danielle gave him a long, slow look, one that made him shift ever so slightly. "Is that so?" she murmured. The security guard cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you don't have a membership, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Richard smiled, satisfied. Danielle glanced over at the concierge desk, where the resort's general manager, Michael Harper, had just walked out of his office. Perfect timing. Michael was in his late 40s, tall, sharp-bugged, and very aware of what was happening. The moment his gaze landed on Danielle, his entire face changed. His posture straightened, his mouth parted slightly in surprise, then recognition. Richard, oblivious, turned to Michael. "Ah, finally, someone with authority," he said. "Would you mind handling this? We've got a bit of an issue with a stray guest." Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept looking at Danielle. Then, slowly, he exhaled. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Dawson, you're mistaken." Richard blinked. "Mistaken?" Michael straightened his tie, suddenly looking very uncomfortable. "This is Ms. Carter," he said. She's not a guest." Richard frowned, confused. "Then what is she? Some new hire?" Danielle laughed softly, unable to hold it in any longer. Michael hesitated for just a second before finally saying the words. "He's the new owner of the resort." Silence. Absolute silence. Richard's expression froze. His smugness evaporated in an instant, replaced by something pale, tight, and horrified. Danielle smiled. "You were saying something about a certain caliber of people?" Richard's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked at Michael, desperately searching for some kind of lifeline. Michael only nodded. "Yeah, she bought the place." The color drained from Richard's face. Danielle took a slow step forward. This was her moment, and she was going to savor it. Richard Dawson stood frozen, his entire body stiff with disbelief. His mouth opened, then closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The room had gone eerily silent. Every member, every staff worker in the grand lobby now focused on him, on her, on the moment that had turned the club's hierarchy upside down. Danielle Carter, the woman he had tried to throw out, was now the owner of the very resort he had spent years parading through like his own personal kingdom. Danielle let the silence linger, let him feel it, the weight of his mistake. Michael Harper, the resort's general manager, cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Mr. Dawson," he said carefully. "Ms. Carter finalized the acquisition of Oceanside Elite Resort last week. As of today, she is the sole owner." Richard's face twitched. This is a joke," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He forced out an awkward chuckle, but no one else was laughing. "You're telling me that she—" He jabbed a finger in Danielle's direction, still unwilling to say her name. "Owns this place?" Danielle tilted her head, mocking amusement in her gaze. "That's exactly what he's telling you." The reality of it finally seemed to sink into Richard's brain, because his posture changed. A subtle but unmistakable shift. His shoulders hunched ever so slightly, his arrogance now fighting with the panic creeping in. Danielle stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She was enjoying this. "You know, Richard," she said smoothly, "I was really looking forward to meeting our club members, getting to know the community." She smiled. "And I have to say, you've made quite the first impression." Richard's jaw clenched. "Now, wait just a minute. I didn't know who you were." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "And that justifies how you treated me?" His face went blotchy, an embarrassing mix of red and pale. He glanced around, searching for backup, for someone to come to his defense. But the usual club regulars who normally hung on his every word, they were silent. avoiding his gaze. This wasn't just his humiliation. This was public humiliation. Richard straightened his jacket, forcing himself to reclaim his usual confidence. "Look, Miss Carter," he said, trying for forced charm, "this is all a misunderstanding. You have to understand, we have high standards here." Danielle's laugh cut through his words, sharp, unamused. "Oh, I understand, Richard. Trust me, I do." She let her gaze flicker up and down, taking in the expensive tailoring, the silver cufflinks. "You've spent years here, haven't you, treating this place like your own personal empire?" Richard's smile wavered. Danielle leaned in just slightly. "Must be strange to realize you're no longer the most powerful person in the room." The muscles in his jaw tightened. Michael Harper interrupted. "Miss Carter," he said, polite but firm, "would you like to continue your tour of the property? I'd be happy to show you any area you haven't had the chance to visit." Danielle smiled. "That sounds lovely." Then she turned deliberately back to Richard. "Unless, of course, Mr. Dawson would like to show me around. After all, he's such an experienced member." Richard stiffened. He was trapped. If he refused, he looked like a coward. If he agreed, he had to spend even more time marinating in his own humiliation. He cleared his throat. "I have a prior engagement," he muttered. Danielle chuckled, shaking her head. "What a shame." With that, she turned, walking past him without a second glance. Michael followed closely behind, leading her toward the VIP lounge, one of the resort's most exclusive spaces. As she stepped through the elegant gold-trimmed doors, the hush of the lobby still clinging to her skin, she couldn't help but feel satisfaction. Because Richard Dawson? This was just the beginning of his reckoning. The VIP lounge was a study in luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the pristine coastline, while plush leather seating and soft candle lighting gave the space an air of effortless elegance. Danielle stepped inside, running a hand along the polished mahogany bar. "Nice," she murmured. "Expensive, but tasteful." Michael, ever the professional, nodded. "We take great pride in maintaining an atmosphere of exclusivity." Danielle smirked. "That's exactly what I intend to change." Michael paused. "Change?" Danielle turned, her expression unreadable. "Let's be honest, Michael. This place has a reputation." She gestured out toward the lounge, the whispers still buzzing in the background. "Old money, old traditions, people like Richard Dawson feeling entitled to dictate who belongs and who doesn't." Michael hesitated. "I won't lie. That culture has been ingrained here for decades." Danielle folded her arms. "Then it's time for a shake-up." Michael studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "What do you have in mind?" Danielle's smile was slow, deliberate. "I think it's time to remind the members of something," she said. "That exclusive doesn't mean exclusionary." She paused. "And that I'm the one who makes the rules now." Later that evening, the club's private email list received an announcement. From Danielle Carter, owner and CEO. Subject: A new era at Oceanside Elite Resort. To our valued members. It has always been the mission of this resort to provide a space of luxury, relaxation, and world-class hospitality. As we move forward into this exciting new chapter, I want to emphasize that Oceanside Elite Resort is a place for everyone who values excellence, not just a select few. To that end, I am implementing a mandatory inclusivity seminar for all club members and staff. This will be an opportunity to ensure that all guests are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. Attendance is required. I look forward to seeing you all there. Warm regards, Danielle Carter, owner, Oceanside Elite Resort. The email spread like wildfire. Some members were intrigued, some were thrilled, and some, like Richard Dawson, were seething. The moment Richard read the email, his hands clenched into fists. His world was shifting beneath his feet, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had spent years treating this place as his sanctuary, his playground, his personal club. Now, he had to sit through a seminar about how to behave properly in a place he once ruled. And worse, he had no choice but to comply. Because if he didn't, Danielle Carter could strip him of his membership entirely. For the first time in his life, Richard Dawson was powerless. And Danielle Carter? She was just getting started. The air inside Oceanside Elite Resort's grand event hall was thick with tension. It wasn't the usual kind, the nervous excitement before an exclusive gala or the hushed anticipation of a high-profitable guest's arrival. No, this was something different. The members of the club, some of the wealthiest, most elite names in the city, sat stiffly in their plush leather seats, faces unreadable. The chandeliers overhead cast a warm golden glow, but no one was in the mood for luxury today. Because today, they weren't here for leisure. They were here for a mandatory inclusivity seminar. And Richard Dawson, the man who once strutted through this resort like a king, was trapped in the very front row. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched against his knees. He had considered skipping it. He had almost dared to test Danielle's patience. But the moment he had even hinted at skipping, Michael Harper had been quick to remind him. Non-compliance meant immediate termination of membership. Danielle Carter had made sure of it. And so here he was, forced to sit through what was, in his eyes, the ultimate humiliation. Danielle took her time as she stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. She wore a sleek, powerfully tailored suit, and when she stood in front of the crowd, she radiated nothing but calm, collected dominance. She scanned the room, letting her gaze settle for an extra moment on Richard before she smiled. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice smooth, controlled. "I appreciate you all being here. I understand this may be unexpected for some of you." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the room. Danielle's smile didn't waver. "For years," she continued, "Oceanside Elite Resort has been a sanctuary for its members, a place of luxury, relaxation, and excellence." She tilted her head slightly. "However, it has also been a place built on certain unspoken rules." The air shifted. Everyone in the room knew what she meant. "The thing about exclusivity is that it often walks a fine line," Danielle said, pacing slowly, "between providing a private, high-class experience and quietly pushing out those who don't fit the mold." Richard's face twitched. Danielle's eyes flicked toward him, but only for a moment. "Now, as the owner of this resort," she continued, "I have no intention of stripping it of its prestige." Her tone was measured, firm. "However, I also have no intention of tolerating a culture where anyone is made to feel less than welcome." Silence. Then, a quiet scoff. It was Richard. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug smirk tugging at his lips. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Danielle heard him. She turned fully to face him, a slow, calculated move. "Did you have something to say, Mr. Dawson?" Richard's smirk faltered slightly, but he wasn't about to back down now. He sat up straighter. "All due respect," he said, voice dripping with false politeness, "I think we're all wondering the same thing. What exactly is the point of all this?" Danielle arched a brow. "You don't see the point?" "Oh, I see your point," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand. "You buy the place, and now you want to put your little stamp on it. Fine, but forcing us to sit through some lecture about inclusivity?" He scoffed. "It's unnecessary. This club has always had standards. We're not excluding anyone, we're simply selective." The room tensed. Danielle let out a soft breath, shaking her head with a small, knowing chuckle. "Selective," she repeated. "Tell me, Richard, when you saw me in the lobby a few days ago, were you being selective then?" Richard's face darkened. "That was different." Danielle folded her arms. You weren't. He stopped himself, catching the trap too late. Danielle smirked. I wasn't what, Richard? Silence. The entire room was watching him now, waiting. He swallowed hard, then looked away. Danielle nodded slowly. That's what I thought. She turned her attention back to the crowd. This isn't about punishing anyone, she said. This is about making sure that every single person who walks through those doors, whether they're a guest, a staff member, or a potential new member, feels respected. She let that sink in before continuing, because respect, that is the real standard of excellence. After the seminar, Richard stormed toward the bar, gripping the edge of the counter tightly. He needed a drink, a strong one. The shame burning in his chest wasn't something he was used to. For years, he had owned every room he walked into. People respected him, feared him. Now, he felt cornered, stripped of the power he had always taken for granted. Mr. Dawson, the voice interrupted. He turned, only to find Michael Harper standing there, arms crossed. Richard scowled. What do you want? Michael didn't flinch. Ms. Carter has asked to review some of the membership policies. Richard stiffened. What the hell does that mean? Michael's expression was carefully neutral. It means there's a review process in place now. Members who have exhibited behavior that goes against the club's new standards, he paused, are subject to revocation. Richard's blood ran cold. You can't do that, he hissed. Michael tilted his head. Actually, he said, she can. Richard stared. For the first time, fear crept into his features. This wasn't just a lecture, this wasn't just some policy change. His membership, his status, was at risk, all because of her. He turned his gaze toward the other side of the lounge, where Danielle stood calmly sipping a cocktail, chatting with other members who now flocked to her. She was already winning them over, and he was already losing. For the first time in his life, Richard Dawson was on the outside looking in. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the ocean's horizon, Danielle Carter stood on the private balcony of the owner's suite. The air smelled of salt and victory. She took a slow sip of her drink, letting the moment settle deep into her bones. She had worked too damn hard to get here. And now, this place belonged to her. The rules had changed. The old guard was shaking. And as for Richard Dawson, he'd learned to adapt or be left behind. Either way, she wasn't losing sleep over it. She had a resort to run,